Well, that took far longer than expected. With these projects, they generally tend to do that. But the Legion's Imperialis core box set is wrapped, and it feels so great to have this project now sitting on my gaming table. I purchased it the weekend it was released in the US, and it sat on a shelf for quite some time due to the usual life stuff getting in the way. I also didn't want to rush it and have something that I obviously wasn't going to be proud of. What I have ended up with is a box that was split in half into Loyalist and Traitor armies. I've painted the Astartes as the Traitor Legion's Sons of Horus, with an accompanying Legio Tritonis Warhound, and on the other side I've painted the Solar Auxilia army as the Loyalist Theta Garmin Deathless cohort. I tried my best to make sure the Legios made sense lore-wise with the armies I chose, as I wanted to keep things as accurate as possible. I do like the word immersion quite a lot. And all in all, the project took a few months in between other projects that I had on the go at the time. Despite the 8mm scale, there are a lot of miniatures to get through, and this will take some time if you are trying to paint these models to any kind of high standard. I started by painting all of the bases in one go. This is to make sure that they're all matched. I went with a very simple but effective process of just priming the bases, base coating them in a mid-tone grey, and masking off one panel on each of the bases and painted them a sand colour to add a little variation to the grey monotony. Then the metallic paint was added accordingly. The bases were then slathered in a mixture of black and brown oil paints that were really thinned down and then left to dry naturally. Some of the oil was buffed off with a kitchen towel, and as a side note, I did not use any varnish prior to the oil wash process. This is because I didn't want the oil just going into the recesses. I kind of wanted it to sit across the entire base. And you can still pull up some of that oil even though it's soaked into the acrylic paint underneath. The bases were then sealed with AK Interactive Ultra Matte varnish. Once that was dry, I then frosted the base with a dry brush of Vallejo Ivory. Once the dry brush phase was completed, I moved on to adding some smoky pigment to give the impression that there are explosive scorch marks on the ground to give the bases a touch more realism. The pigment was then fixed and a final touch of matte varnish was added. Finally, some highlights were added to the metallic paints as they are generally dulled down by the process of oil wash and matte varnishing. The bases were then finished. The bases obviously need some little men to stand on them, so we're now going to turn our attention onto the Titans infantry and vehicles. I decided to move on to the Theta Garmin Solar Auxilia as they seemed like they were going to be a little bit trickier to deal with than the colour scheme of the Sons of Horus. Why? Well, they are a black and white colour scheme, and at this scale I wasn't too sure how I was going to make the scheme visually interesting. But I didn't want to go down the road of the usual blues and reds and browns that I've seen a lot of Solar Auxilia painted as. I also just kind of fell in love with the Deathless cohort, despite them being just black and white. They also have an affiliation in the lore with the Legio Astorum Legio, which is one of my favourite Legios, so it was going to be Deathless cohort or nothing at all. With that being said, I decided to take on the tanks first to figure out how to do the white of the colour scheme, as the tanks were mainly white from what I could glean from official material discussing the Theta Garmin cohort. Before any paint went on though, I magnetised all of the weapons on the tanks with epoxy putty and rare earth magnets, and I ended up starting from a base of grey and transitioning up to a little bit of white. I've learned from painting my fair share of Tau that painting white generally involves not painting that much white. But unlike my previous Tau models, I wanted the Solar Auxilia to look dirty and very grimdark. This would suit my gaming board quite nicely on completion, and if I use the same weathering treatments across all of the models for both armies, then things should feel quite cohesive. The tanks came out well, but tanks were a very different beast from infantry. So I split the difference, and instead of moving straight down to the infantry, I decided to paint the largest of the infantry, which are the Sentinels, first. I've already made a video on the painting process for the Sentinels, which you can find linked in the description. The main infantry seemed to take forever though. The amount of detail captured on these models is impressive, but at the same time that means there is a lot of changing of paints. The oil wash over the white at this scale was very hit and miss. Sometimes I would just destroy the white, and sometimes it worked beautifully. but I fixed most of the issues in the highlighting and cleanup stages. But yeah, if I was to be completely honest, this whole process was a bit of a slog with the Solar Auxilia infantry. Once the models were finished, they were then dry fitted to bases, and once I had a placement I was happy with, I added a craft knife cut on the surface of the base and to the underside of the model for better adhesion, and then added superglue to both parts. If any glue oozed out of the sides between the models and the bases, I just waited for the glue to completely dry and added a bit of paint that matched the base or the model and added matte varnish over the top. Once the vehicles and infantry of the Solar Auxilia were finished, I then moved on to the Astartes, which I was feeling much better about going into, as the Sons of Horus army has a way less involved colour scheme, and one that I didn't need to be experimenting around with to get to work. I did not make a video on painting the Sons of Horus either, as there are plenty of very good videos out there on how to paint that scheme, with which most cover the same ground. But I will say this, if you want a grim dark green look, then prime the model in black. If you want the look of the brighter sea foam green though, definitely base coat your model in grey, preferably a light grey. But I went with a black base coat though to make my Sons of Horus army more cursed than they already were. The painting process between the tanks and the infantry were the exact same, with no tweaks needed between the differences in models. The larger models looked just as good as the smaller infantry models with the method that I used. I also managed to get the Astartes done much quicker, probably because there are less of them than the Solar Auxilia to be fair, but also because of the simpler green scheme. The way I painted my Sons of Horus green is basically the same as how Games Workshop would tell you to do it. Some differences are as follows. I used a black base coat instead of grey, and instead of using any washes for shading from Games Workshop, I instead varnished my model, went in with a raw umber oil wash, quite thinned down. You want this to be treated as a recess wash rather than covering the entirety of the model. Wait for it to dry, rub off any excess oil where you don't want it, matte varnish the entire model, then go in with your usual highlights that are suggested by Games Workshop. And that's basically how I did my models. Then all that was left to do was the completion of the Warhound Titans. I did make painting tutorials for both of these Titans, which were the 2 videos previous to this one. I will just say that there seems to be an error in the instructions where there is no instructions for adding the shoulder joint hatch doors, and on my first Titan I completely missed adding these doors, then I had to go back in at the very end of the process and get them painted and matched correctly to all the previous weathering and work I'd done, which was a bit of a time sink and quite irritating. But maybe I'm missing something, but I'm pretty sure I checked the instructions a bunch of times and found nothing about the hatches. If the instructions are there, then my apologies. With all that being said, I now have a finished core box set of Legion's Imperialis miniatures that are sitting on my gaming table, and here are my thoughts. The positive first, I do like the larger scale of the models. The models have a good amount of detail and individuality. It feels less cartoon-like compared to the earlier Epic offerings, especially with the infantry. The details are not too dense and not too minimal. I think GW struck a good balance here. The weapon variants are also nice to have, and I do look forward to Games Workshop maybe adding holes or brackets for potential magnetization options, but I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon. I just feel it is slightly redundant offering multiple loadouts, but not offering a method of making said weapons interchangeable, and I know that this also applies to their 28mm scale models too. The Titans are great sculpts, and I have been a huge fan of all of the Adeptus Titanicus stuff since the 2018 re-release, so no complaints there. Finally, I also do like the quality of the box and the rulebook too, it feels quite premium. Now on to my criticisms. I believe a box set like this should be able to play a game straight out of the box, but I have read that there are not enough points to do so when the armies are split between Astartes and the Solar Auxilia. If this is true, then that's a big miss for me. It is not made clear that this box set does not contain enough pieces to play an official 1v1 battle. Now I know I have read that there are rules to be able to play a game with what is in the contents of this box, but I don't think it really sits in line with what people were thinking when it comes to an epic battle, as it were. Well, that's just me speaking for myself, of course I can't speak on anyone else's behalf, but is it me being greedy or is it GW? I'll let you be the judge of that. Theoretically, this is just a glorified battle force if my previous assertions hold true. I also feel there should have been more miniatures all around and an inclusion of a small amount of terrain or ruins. That would have gone a long way, I think. Card terrain, at the very least, could have easily been achieved if they didn't want to put plastic in there, and it makes a lot of sense at this scale, especially with an introductory box to a new game system to most people. This was done decades ago to great effect and could have easily been implemented here to at least help set the scene for newcomers. Now, this is my final gripe, and it is my biggest gripe, that's why I saved it to the end. Now, before anyone says anything, I understand the injection mold making process is a high-stress environment for the plastics that are being injection molded, and I understand why the certain things I'm about to complain about are in the models themselves. But that doesn't really make me feel any better. And what I'm speaking about, of course, are these weird things that are happening in the infantry, which are support points which allow the models to be popped out without being destroyed during the dropping out of the injection mold making process. But they are ugly. They take me out of the immersion that I'm trying to get, and to get rid of those points is a lot of work. If you don't want to destroy your model, you have to be very, very sensitive and knowledgeable with how to use a Dremel, or a craft knife, or epoxy putty, or all of the above. Is a newcomer going to be doing any of that? No. And if they attempt it, they're probably going to either hurt themselves or hurt the model, or both. And that's not going to be a great initial experience for anyone getting into the hobby. And yes, things like draft angles, shut-off angles, and kiss-off angles exist, and it is a very delicate dance between the mold and the plastic where they have to dance together perfectly thousands of times, and that part has to come out beautifully. So I know that there is a lot that goes into the design process, but for literally decades, Tamiya, Airfix, and Gundam models have been able to produce injection molded parts that are finer and smaller and more intricate with ease without having these bizarre embellishments that are added, which could have easily been resolved, in my opinion, in the 3D environment before they even got to cutting the mold itself. And I don't even need to bring up other companies here, because the issue that I'm having is Games Workshop have proved that they can do this themselves. They've got wonderful Warhounds, wonderful Titans across the board, wonderful vehicles even in this box set. To then have these bizarre, smeary infantry sitting in the middle of all of it, that to me is very disappointing. Finally, I'll say, we have 3D printers. Anyone who has a printer under the price of even $150, you can print models more intricate, more detailed, at the infantry scale, the tank scale, and even the Titans, with ease. Fine, there's a bit of cleanup. Even the cleanup there, you're not having these bizarre, smudgy, smeary 3D artifacts left in the model itself. You have a perfectly fine model, you just have to remove the supports. Removing these things in the plastic is a nightmare. So yeah, I'm sorry if I'm kind of treading over ground repeatedly here, but I can't explain how much this infuriates me. And this is coming from somebody not who's just doing a reaction video the day it comes out complaining that a picture that they've seen doesn't have enough models in it. I have worked for months finishing this project, and I was making sure that I had every single model finished before I drew any conclusions. And in my opinion, this box set is not really worth it. Everyone has different budgets and goals, but I do not believe this is friendly for anyone who's trying to get into Epic for the first time. No terrain and not enough models, in my opinion, is not very epic. You want to have a ton of models to work with, and get into battles with a friend the following day after Christmas with a feasible army between some flavor terrain. This does not feel like that, and I'm not saying GW needs to meet my very specific personal needs. I'm only judging GW by its own previous releases. All in all, in spite of the pretty models, this just feels a lot like shrinkflation, sadly. Please bear in mind that in spite of all of my gripes, I own everything that GW has released for Legions Imperialis, apart from the roads and ruins, and I only don't own those because I'd already had a board finished before those were released. I will continue to support this release, and I have purchased everything with my own money. I would rather have this around with its flaws than not around at all. My criticism comes from a place of respect for the previous Epic Scale brand and care for where it currently sits today. I want this to continue to grow and flourish. Moving forward, I think a more generous box set would be appropriate to open the door to more people and feel less penny pinching. I will leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to support what I do here at Bunker 6, please consider looking at one of the links in the description, which will enable you to do so. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I'm Vincent signing off from here at Bunker 6.